welcome to Constitutional Chats, and we'd love to have you talk a little bit, since you helped design our 90-day study, a little bit about an overview of the entire study, and then also talk a little bit about today's topic.
I would love to. Thanks for that introduction, Kathy, and thanks for putting such a flattering photograph of me up there. That was from many years ago, and when I was much younger and a little bit lighter, but good memory. But I'm always delighted to be with you all, especially to get such great questions. I know from your wonderful students that you have, and it's been a pleasure working with you. But I am really impressed. This is a really ambitious project this year. The 90-day study is really ambitious, I think, but it's a great opportunity for us to dive deep into the wisdom that the founders had and really showcase how that wisdom allowed them to not only learn from the mistakes of past regimes and past constitutions, but also anticipate things coming in the future. I think that they would have a lot to say about things that developed in the 1790s, everything from the French Revolution through the emergence of communists and totalitarian regimes in the 20th century. And I think their wisdom, their constitutional wisdom, really does shine through in the sense that they were able to frame a constitution and a system of government that anticipated not maybe the specifics of what these types of constitutions and governments would look like in the future, but they laid down principles and ideas that allowed us to recognize what was wrong with those regimes and those constitutions that would come. So I think this is a great opportunity to showcase the depth of that wisdom. And it's a wisdom, I think, that especially came for the founders from a very, very careful study of history. And when you look at the literature during the ratification debates, on both sides, by the way, not just the Federalists or those who supported the Constitution, but the Anti-Federalists, those who had concerns about the proposed Constitution. And I think, therefore, also the Anti-Federalists played an important role in shaping our constitutional mind as Americans. But I think what you see is just how carefully they studied history and tried to learn about what was good about some of the things in the past, but also what were the problems that we didn't want to repeat. And that deep and careful study of history, I think, especially gave them a very realistic understanding of human nature or what human beings were like. And so I just want to throw out here, one of the things I think that I hope that people will see as they look at all the entire scope of the project is just how much a certain understanding of what human beings are like influence the creation of the Constitution, but also help provide a foundation for its longevity. And so that may be a good sort of jumping off point into the topic for today, which is how to avoid the pitfalls of ancient Greek democracies. This is something that you find both sides, again, Federalists and Anti-Federalists, bringing up because they studied ancient democracies and especially Athenian democracy very carefully, because even though in the 1780s, when we're sort of working towards creating the Constitution, the buzzword was republicanism, right? Lowercase r, republicanism. We have to have a republic, but it also had to have what they called a democratic side to it. It had to be democratic in nature as well, which means that the people somehow have to rule. So in looking at the ancient democracies, one thing that the framers of the Constitution noticed, and I'll sort of spotlight James Madison in particular here, because I think he devoted probably the most time and the most study of ancient regimes and constitutions, and especially Athenian democracy. But one thing that they noticed was that these ancient democracies were prone to at least three major problems. One was, in an ancient democracy, what was known as a pure democracy, the process was every citizen got together to vote on every law, right, and every policy, which meant, first of all, you had to limit the number of citizens in that democracy. I mean, normally it was around 10,000 or so, give or take, because, it's just hard to squeeze 10,000 plus people into one space to vote on things. And what that meant was that the popular nature, the democratic nature, in a way, was really limited in those ancient democracies. There were many people who lived in Athens, but only a percentage of them, 10,000 or so, could vote. So how do we increase sort of popular representation or popular participation in our regime was one problem they wanted to deal with. The other thing they noticed in ancient democracies was that, as Alexander Hamilton noted in Federalist Number 9, they were constantly vibrating between the extremes of anarchy on the one hand and tyranny on the other. And ancient democracies, though great in theory, again, the citizens are voting on things, they're voting on everything. There were no checks on the vote of the majority. And sometimes that majority decided to do things that were not necessarily good. In fact, some of them were anti-democratic. They frequently, for various economic or security reasons, voted in really tyrannical bodies and would create tyrannical decemvirates and things like this to rule. And that would ultimately lead, at least temporarily, to the end of democracy. Until after time there was another revolt and they would reinstate democracy, and then they would cycle through it again. So how do we prevent that kind of emergence of tyranny that results through a lack of checks, in a way, on what the majority wants to be done? And then the third major problem, I think, that James Madison, again, especially identified was that, again, because there are no checks on the will of the majority, again, you want the majority to rule, but there's no checks on that will. They themselves often became tyrannical and would oppress and violate the rights of those in the minority. And this is the problem of what James Madison called majority faction. And so a faction forms, and especially when a majority becomes a faction and they want to do things that violate the rights of others. So how do we solve these three problems? And I think these things were problems that the framers of the Constitution really focused on solving. The Anti-Federalists contributed to the conversation about these things because some of these solutions to these problems were very new. They were what Alexander Hamilton called improvements to the science of politics, which meant they were new. And the Anti-Federalists, some of them weren't sure about whether these would work, which led to a great 8-month or so, 7-month debate during the ratification process over questions like just how democratic do we want this Constitution to be? How Republican should it be? Can we combine the two together in a way that actually prevents the emergence of tyranny? So I think that was a big question that they focused on. So that's kind of an overview of the thing, or at least the thing in terms of the problems that they learned from history and the types of things that they were trying to solve through the new Constitution. So I'm happy to stop here and see if there are questions that you want to go with, or if you want. I can talk a lot, so I will stop. And
no, that's great. That is a wonderful overview. And I loved your 3 points on the weaknesses of democracies. And in point 3, when you talked about the will of the majority, could you talk a little bit more about how a republic can protect the minority or the views of the minority?
Yeah, sure. And again, this is the theme, of course, the major theme of Federalist Number 10, which a lot of people, I'm sure, are familiar with. The idea of having a republic in which you replace everybody getting together to vote with elections for representatives, and then the representatives go off and deliberate and vote and pass laws. Just that benefit alone, that change alone, James Madison argued in Federalist 10, it may not prevent the problem of majority faction or majority tyranny, but it will make it less likely and slow it down. It will slow down the process. Because as Madison pointed out, in a pure democracy where everybody gets together to vote, there are 2 problems with this. One is everybody's there and they're casting their votes, and they, traditionally cast votes by, by stones, and white stone, black stone, whatever it is. And then somebody has to clean up all the stones later. But so the problem there is everybody's in one place and everybody knows, how people are voting. So they know whether they're part of the majority or not. So everybody who voted this way, they sense their common strength. And the second problem is they're all right there together. So they feel their common strength as a majority. They're already in the same place. So the idea is, hey, let's just do what we want, right? We have the numbers, we're all together. Let's formulate what it is we want to do. And in those circumstances, it's very easy. There really are no safeguards for those who voted the other way. And if that majority wants to do something that violates the rights, again, there's no real stopping them. James Madison pointed out in Federalist 10 that the benefit of representation in a republic is you add a kind of layer or a filter, right? So the people can vote, but they can't immediately put into effect if they want to do something factious. Not to say they're always going to be factious, but if the majority wants to do factious that would violate the rights of the minority, it slows down, right? It adds a layer or a filter, slows down the effectiveness of that. And then it's sort of kicked to Congress, right? Where Congress then can deliberate and try to filter out the unwanted or factious passions and things like that, and hopefully pass laws that don't violate the rights of the minority. That's the next step or the next safeguard.
Well, that's great. And, when we speak in schools, that's one of the things that we find that students today are just not being taught. They're not being taught that we are a republic. They're not being taught what a republic is. And it's one thing that we really love to talk about when we go into the classrooms and find that students are excited to learn about it. But I'm going to pass it off to Tova now, who I know has got some great questions as always. And so Tova, we're going to let you take it away here.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm bursting with questions, so I'll try to keep it short. But yeah, this is a fascinating topic. I was hoping you could talk a bit more about Greek democracy itself. Like, how did it develop, and then why did it eventually die out?
Fantastic question. And how did it develop is a tough historical question because the historical evidence is a little sketchy. But here's the sort of general idea of I think how the founders thought about how Greek democracy developed. So the sort of traditional idea was and this goes all the way back, by the way, to Aristotle. I didn't know how far back we wanted to go, but if you've read Aristotle, he says there are basically 6 different types of constitutions, right? And he says there are 3 good ones and there are 3 bad ones. Now, Aristotle says among the 3 good types of constitutions as monarchy, which he says is the best, interestingly enough. And then, rule by one. Then there's aristocracy, which is supposed to be rule by a constitution or regime in which the most excellent few, right? The few, but the most excellent citizens rule. And then there's what he calls a polity, which is kind of like our modern republic, in that there's a large middle class. So it's not the rich who rule or the few excellent, and it's not the many poor, excuse me. But there's a kind of large pool of middle class, if you want to call them, people that are in charge, because they're the majority. And then on the bad side of constitutions, Aristotle says, the worst of the worst is tyranny, which is rule by one person for their own selfish reasons. The second worst is oligarchy, which is ruled by the very few extremely wealthy, and they rule or pass laws for their own interests. And the least bad of the bad regimes, Aristotle said, was democracy, interestingly enough. So Tova, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this. You've heard this, you probably heard this before, but so my point is Aristotle identified democracy as a bad and dangerous regime in itself. So the reason is that it's ruled by the majority, but that majority rules only for its own interests. And it doesn't really care about the other citizens, those who have more wealth, for example, or a little bit wealthier, those who have land. So the reason I'm being sort of long-winded about this is to say that how democracy came about was probably a simple matter of force. All three of the bad regimes are what you usually find in ancient Greek democracies. You either find tyrannies, typically you find tyrannies, oligarchies, or democracies. And how did they come about? Force. So sometimes you have a tyrant, single tyrant, he's overthrown by the oligarchs who have enough money to hire mercenaries to come in and kill him, right? And then the oligarchs rule, and then the many, the demos, as they were called, right? Because the word democracy means, crassy means rule by, and demos means the many poor. So the democracy, the many have the numbers, and eventually they get tired of being ruled by the wealthy and they overthrow them. And this institutes a cycle, right? A perpetual cycle of regimes being overthrown and changing. So I'm being a little abstract and theoretical here and long-winded, Tova, and I apologize for that. But how did democracies come about? The founders understood well that, yes, the idea of democracy is a good idea because it's a form of popular government, but ancient democracies usually simply arose by force, overthrowing another type of rule that they didn't like, and they often died by force, right? Because sooner or later, the democracy got lazy or selfish or greedy, and somebody comes in and overthrows the democracy, and it's just a constant perpetual cycle, what they call revolution. Sorry, go ahead.
There's absolutely no, comparison to today. That's really just kidding.
Right.
But no, that's fascinating. And so I guess that's so interesting. I actually never heard that forms of democracy or forms of government laid out like that. So I guess it's just so interesting that monarchy is the best, but tyranny is the worst. I guess to modern day, they seem like different sides of the same coin. But I guess what would you say what separates monarchy from tyranny and aristocracy from oligarchy is like self-interest, where the good is like ruling for the for the benefit of the nation, and the latter is ruling for the benefit of self-interest?
You nailed it. That's exactly the distinction Aristotle made. So the three bad types of rule, those who are ruling rule only for their interest, and they want to oppress everybody else. So in Aristotle's way of thinking, the good regimes, whether it's a monarch, an aristocracy, or a polity, they rule in such a way that's good for the whole, for everybody, and they are less likely to violate the rights of those who aren't part of their particular class. And so what's interesting, and the other side of this, Tova, this is a really great point that you've raised. The other reason Aristotle tended to favor monarchies, aristocracies, and polities is because there was more stability to them. So on the bad side, tyranny, oligarchy, democracy is constantly changing, right? It's in constant flux. This is, again, what Hamilton meant, I think, when he wrote that these ancient democracies were constantly vibrating between the extremes of tyranny and anarchy, right? But on the side of monarchy, aristocracy, and polity, you had something more stable and long-lasting. And I think that's another lesson that the founders learned from the ancients on this question. Again, you're right. I mean, the founders thought, monarchy is monarchy. Even if you get a good monarchy, it's still a kind of tyranny, right? So they reject that idea. But they also try to, I think, identify or infuse a kind of stability, right, into this new constitution. And I think they really latched onto this idea of a polity consisting of a majority of Americans, not simply ruled by the extraordinarily wealthy or by the extremely poor. And that would allow for a large number of popular participation by adding representation. And it would better protect the rights of the minorities and would be more stable and long lasting. And I think they were onto something. We still have the same constitution with amendments and all that, right? It's been through a lot, but 200 some years later, we still have this constitution. So
for sure. And when you compare it to like the French Revolution, which had such lofty ideals, which kind of went more the anarchy route, and wasn't as stable with all the regime changes very rapidly. But I was curious about this idea of like who could vote. So obviously when America was founded, voting was pretty limited compared to today, which it was all over the world. But it was more limited to white men. I believe property owning in some states in the beginning. Correct me if I'm wrong. So was that just like a given based on how historically voting had been, or was there any sort of dissent or debate about opening voting rights more broadly to more fit the model of a democracy?
Yeah, that gets, again, a great question. So in the ancient democracies, voting in a democracy, again, which literally means rule by the many poor, those who could vote, it was interestingly enough, it wasn't about who could vote in a democracy. It was about excluding those who weren't eligible to vote. So who wasn't eligible to vote in an ancient democracy? People who owned over a certain amount of wealth, for example, or a certain amount of land, which is, again, kind of counterintuitive in a way. But in an ancient democracy, it really was run by those who were not among the wealthier classes or the landed classes. That they were excluded explicitly in ancient democratic regimes. Now, interestingly enough, over time, when you've studied British history, right? If you study British history, you know that Great Britain for the longest time was based on an aristocratic system. Now, Aristotle, when he talked about an aristocracy, he was talking about rule by the truly excellent people. That is, people who were good, virtuous, decent people. But the British system of aristocracy, if you've studied it, and I'm going to exaggerate a little bit here for the sake of dramatic effect, they were not always the best sort of people. They owned land and they owned all the wealth, right? But that didn't really make them good, excellent people. And they often, again, in this modern British aristocratic system, ruled for their own interest, not for the good of the whole. That's where the idea of property requirements come from, right? So you have to own landed property to have any kind of political say in the British aristocratic system. The American colonies are born out of that in a way. So even after we declare independence in 1776, and the states, the American states, former colonies, now create their own republican constitutions, they kind of carry over that tradition of having a property requirement. Why? Because that's the British tradition. That's the way it's been for hundreds of years. So they inherit that way of thinking, but they very quickly, well, gradually, but relatively quickly, do away with those property requirements. In the 1790s, almost every state reduced the property requirements to virtually nothing, so greatly expanding the number of people that could vote and hold office. And by the early 1800s, they were mostly gone. So, but it took a while to get rid of those requirements. But again, what this shows is, I think, the desire, the impetus of the founders to open up the franchise more, to make, if we really want a popular government, it has to include as many people as possible having the franchise and the right to hold office. So,
right, and then with regard, thank you. With regards to like women, was there any? I mean, I'm sure in ancient Greece it was limited to men, right? And so, was there any sort of discussion about expanding the vote to women, or was that something that had to be done? Only the conversation only started much later as society got more, I suppose, progressive.
Are you talking about in the Athenian or Greek societies, or in American society in the early?
In both. I assume that the vote was only limited to men in Athenian society, or was it open to? Mm-hmm.
Yes, in Athens, yeah, it was typically limited to men, and the men went, as you can imagine, went to great lengths to ensure that it stayed that way. And even going so far as, there have been some great plays. If you're familiar with any ancient Greek comedies, Sophocles and others, right, are writing plays. And some of the most famous plays are ones in which women take over and get the vote. And so the men lose control in the Athenian democracy, women get the vote and they take control, and they are portrayed as just ruining Athens. So it's propaganda, probably. It's meant to be comedy, but it's just an example of the lengths to which this was meant to be a male-centered democracy at the time. Now, in early America, all these old traditions, right, that we inherited from, either ancient democracies or even the British aristocratic system, all these traditions are being challenged, and we're breaking free from them. So there are moments in the 1790s, especially, where people in America are saying, well, why shouldn't women vote? And they do have debates about that. So if men can vote, and we're reducing the property requirement to allow more and more men to be able to vote, why shouldn't women be able to vote? In the state of Virginia, they came very, very close in the 1790s to allowing women with property, who held property in their own names, or if they were widows, to be able to vote. Didn't pass in Virginia. It did pass in, I believe, Massachusetts and New Jersey for a while, where women who held property and met the property requirement could vote if they were single or widowed. So, and then it takes some backward steps for another century, as we know, right? But all of this is being challenged, and they're rethinking these things in the early republic. So, again,
Oh, thank
fantastic
you.
thoughts. Yeah, these are great.
Thanks. And then I had another question. We were talking in my government class yesterday, actually, about this idea of majority rule. And my teacher, I never thought about this before, kind of described the idea of civil rights and civil liberties as a check against the majority, because it protects minority rights and kind of that makes it so that the majority can't do whatever they want to the minority. So I was curious, did the idea of like inherent, I guess, God-given civil rights and civil liberties, did that exist in the ancient Greek form of democracy at all? And then how was that developed in American democracy?
Oh, that's really, I love that question. It's there's no concept of natural rights in ancient Greece as we find them expressed, say, in the Declaration of Independence. That's the result of some enlightenment thinkers. I'm sure you're familiar with John Locke and Algernon Sidney and others who are developing the idea of individual God-given inherent natural rights. And then the Americans latch onto this wholeheartedly from the early 1700s on. And those do become the idea that you as an individual have rights not from government and not from society, but from God or nature, or nature's God, as the Declaration says, right? Those do become important ideas that allow us to say, government shouldn't be doing this, or other citizens should be doing this. And by the way, I just mentioned in passing, this is why James Madison, I know I talk a lot about James Madison, but I've spent a lot of time studying him, thought that in the end, a Bill of Rights would especially be useful, because it reminds us of the idea that we have rights that should not be violated, right? Now, in ancient Greece, what they had was a concept not of natural individual rights, but they did have a concept of justice. At least some of them did. And again, I'm going to bring Aristotle back up. Aristotle probably wrote the most among the well-known ancient Greek thinkers and philosophers about justice. And Aristotle I think one of the ways he defines justice is to say, justice means people ought to have what they deserve. So what is it right for you to have, or what is fitting, right, in a way? So somebody who deserves honor, they ought to get that honor, and that's justice. Somebody who deserves blame ought to get blame, and that's justice. And for somebody not to get the honor or praise they deserve, or the blame or punishment that they deserve, is injustice. So there was an idea of right and wrong, and this also sort of applied to property. So interestingly enough, though, there weren't sort of the individual rights of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, religious liberty that we think of as fundamental American principles. For Aristotle and some of the Greeks, there was the idea of property rights. That is, your property is your property, and it ought to be protected. And for someone to take something from you that you deserve, that is, you worked for it, you earned it, what could be considered an act of injustice, right? And for somebody to have more that they didn't earn or deserve, interestingly enough, could be considered unjust. Now, all of that had to be weighed in light of the concerns for the good of the whole city, right? So private individual rights, even the loose conception of property rights, always had to be weighed about what was good for the city as a whole. And again, I'm doing a lot more talking here than I intended to, but on this point, this is another problem with these regimes, these ancient regimes, whether it's oligarchy or democracy, right? On the bad side of things from Aristotle. The problem with those two types of regimes is that they are all about property. And when the oligarchs are in power, they're trying to squeeze every penny they can from the poor. And when the poor, the many, are in power in a democracy, they're trying to take money from those who have property and redistribute it among themselves. And that is one of the leading causes of faction. And again, the founders recognized that problem and tried to deal with it. So it looks like, oh, did we lose Tova? It looks like she froze for a second there. Probably because I'm talking too much.
No, I'm sure she'll be back. She may have just lost connection. But yeah, I'm sure she'll be back. But let's go ahead and go to Jewel and Jorn.
Hey guys. Happy birthday.
Professor.
Very good.
Thank you. It's a great discussion. Janine is very fond of the ancient thinkers, and they come up all the time on constitutional chat. So this is a fun show.
Good.
What are some of the pitfalls of the Greek democracies that you see us trending towards as Americans?
Wow, that's a great question. I'll just it's a great follow-up to, I think, in a way, to what I was just talking about, the emergence, I think, especially in the 20th century and maybe in the last half of the 20th century to today, the reemergence of an emphasis on economic class as a way to distinguish among American citizens. I think, but the founders might say that, look, we have to recognize that those differences exist, but they would warn us, I think, about using those economic distinctions as a means to divide Americans to the point at which they can no longer remain united upon certain fundamental principles. So I think this is one of the sort of lingering influences of Marxism and that way of thinking, and as it has sort of seeped into our way of thinking, is that everything has to be everybody has to fit into an economic group, and the idea is that every economic group has to be pitted against every economic group, and again, hopefully you can see the echoes of that way of thinking from the problems of ancient regimes, where it was either the oligarchs or the wealthy fighting the poor, or the poor fighting the wealthy. And I think the founders would say we have to be careful about slipping into that mode, that simple mode of thinking. It's true, these things exist. We have to recognize them, and they're not totally unimportant. But if that becomes the only thing that we focus on, it becomes extraordinarily divisive, and it makes it difficult for us to overcome those things, those differences, and start thinking about the common good of the entire country, the entire body of citizens. And again, this is why I think the founders, the framers of the Constitution, found themselves at the time in 1787, when the Constitution was created, they found that the United States as a whole already was kind of like this polity that Aristotle described, where there was mostly a middle class. You had some very wealthy people, you had some very poor people, but the vast majority of people were just sort of middle class, making a decent living, working hard, right? And they were the ones who formed the majority. And with a well-constructed constitution that could take advantage of that, hopefully we can provide, again, these sort of constitutional filters that make it less likely that even that middle class, the majority middle class, will pass factious laws that try to violate the property rights or the religious rights or whatever it might be of those who aren't part of that middle class. Hope that helped. That's such a great question.
Yes, of course. Yeah. So I've been really interested in how apparent this partyist mentality is lately. When originally the two parties were formed, it was more, you kind of aligned yourself every election with who you liked, not their party. That seemed like the original idea. Now it's very, very partyist, where even if I don't like you, I'm going to vote with my party. But it seems like that mentality has almost polluted the republic into a democracy, because now everyone can see, well, this is the way I voted, and it's such a staying point and such a point of tension for many people. So, oftentimes you'll say, well, I'm just going to take the road most traveled. I'm just going to vote with you because I don't, that's the only way we're going to stay acquaintances even. So I just want to know what you say on that.
Yeah, another great question, and great thoughts that you had. So again, the main problem, I think, with ancient democracies that the founders identified was the problem of faction. When a majority gets power and they want to, do things that they think are right, and in the process they want to harm the rights of others. And the Constitution was framed, again, 1787. It's framed and ratified in 1788. It was framed and ratified at a time when there were no real political parties, as you know, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that they didn't anticipate the development of political parties. I think James Madison thought that people were probably going to divide into parties at some point. It happened. The study of history revealed that every society, every regime had sooner or later developed into different parties. But often those parties had to do with, again, wealth and class, or economic status or class. And so one of the things I think James Madison tried to do, again, as one of the major framers of the Constitution, was, if we're going to have parties, let's try to divide them along lines that are not, again, simply based on economic class. So let's have so the initial parties, the Federalists and the Republicans, Jeffersonian Republicans, what divided them was, for example, a different understanding of how much power the national government should have versus the state governments. They disagreed on how far free speech went. You have the right to free speech, but what does that mean, right? Is it totally open, or are there some limits to free speech? And so I think the initial idea of parties was, yes, if we're going to have them, let's make them kind of broad in a way, and not simply along economic lines, because that, again, historically is the most common reasons parties turn into factions. Now, George Washington, and I know you guys know this too, George Washington thought, if we can avoid parties altogether, we should, for exactly the reasons you laid out. Because parties become substitutes. Washington thought that parties can become like crutches or substitutes for individual thinking about who to vote for, where your position is on a particular policy or law. And Washington warned that even though parties might start off sort of benign and not dangerous, history shows that they can very, very quickly degenerate into factions, and the parties just sort of go to war with each other. And then what you lose, again, in the process is not just individuals thinking for themselves as free citizens should, but you lose a kind of fundamental unity among the American people that should exist even as Americans disagree on specific things. So I think they were very concerned about the emergence of parties, and if we're going to have them, what types of parties are they going to be? So I think that's a really good concern that you brought up.
Thank you. Could you say that that a pitfall of any government, the pitfall of the ancient Greek democracies, the pitfall of any government, the greatest one could be getting the question wrong of how to protect or making this not their preordinate question. How to protect the greatest liberty and sovereignty of individual person. And what I mean by that is that if there's any other question as your number one goal, do you think that that might have been what the Greeks missed in their democracy? Because if you say no government, then your neighbors can get together and they can be the government and decide that you should die. And there's nothing strong enough to necessarily stop your neighbors from doing that. But if you say, let's have a government that can stop them from doing that, well, you're giving them a certain amount of that government, a certain amount of your liberty and sovereignty, to trading that so that you can have more liberty than you would have if there was no government. So that's my thought process for the question.
Yeah, again, very thoughtful. And here's the thing. So the pardon me. And this is something else that the founders, I think, picked up on. The point you're raising right here is they, in addition to creating a constitution that does a better job of, by the way, there's no 100% guarantee that any constitution can prevent majority tyranny or faction, right? There's no guarantee, but it should slow it down. It should make it less likely, right? So what the founders and framers wanted to do was establish a constitution that would make majority tyranny less likely, and also provide this kind of stability, right, in society and political society. But the other thing they wanted to add was a concern for individual rights and individual liberty. And I think they saw that was actually glaringly absent from the concerns of the ancient democracies. So ancient democracies, interestingly enough, I don't know that they even had a concept of individual liberty in the way that you're thinking about it, the way that we think about it today as Americans. So everything, again, in ancient democracies, who ruled, and how they ruled, it really kind of came down to force. Who had the numbers or the swords, right? And in ancient democracies, this is, by the way, very telling, I think, about the American concern with liberty and the ancient Greek lack of concern for individual liberty. So today, under our constitutional system, our assumption is you as a citizen are free to do anything as long as it's not prohibited by law, right? So your liberty means you can do this as long as there's not a law prohibiting it. In ancient democracies and ancient regimes, it was the inverse. You were assumed not to be free to do something unless the law permitted it. That's kind of mind-blowing if you think about it, right? So unless there was a law saying you were allowed to do this, you were not at liberty to do it. So liberty was very, very limited. Individual freedom was very, very limited in these ancient democracies and regimes. Unless you just had the force or the swords and the numbers to just do it anyway. I'm just going to do what we want because we've got an army. But
I think we have a lot of.
Say that again. Sorry.
I think we have a lot of audience questions. I want to thank you for your
sure,
answer.
Yeah.
If you were finished, I don't know if I thought you were done. I'm sorry.
No, that's great. That's a great question.
Well, thank you. And we do have a lot of audience questions, and we so appreciate our audience's engagement today. First of all, Tracy asks about the Electoral College and the move. There is a move in among certain people and groups to want to do away with the Electoral College. And would that, in your eyes, be a move of our country towards a democracy and away from a republic, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so I think the framers set up the electoral system. Again, their goal was to have a Republican means, a Republican way, lowercase r Republican, right? With sort of layers or filters of elections for electing the president with a Democratic or popular base. So they thought that they had found a way to make it, both Democratic and Republican, but in a new way. So going to a simple majority vote for an office as important as the office of the presidency, the founders were concerned would be opening or inviting a return to the same kinds of problems of democracy that you saw in the ancient Athenian democracy. Passions get worked up when there's a simple majority vote, and especially for an election, for the presidency, the passions get worked up. That really brings people together into groups, and it's very easy, especially in a country where we have a two-party system, basically, for one of them to become the majority. And I think that looked too much like the potential for majority tyranny that they saw in ancient democracy. So what you do is you create a very, very complicated electoral system that allows for layers or filters. You have the electoral college, and then votes are cast, and then it goes to the House of Representatives, and that provides the opportunity to filter out some of the passions and maybe the factious inclinations of the groups in an election. So I think they would advise against it.
Thank you. And Ron Meyer asked an interesting question, and I give a shout out to Ron as one of our past We the Future contest senior essay winners. And Ron is also an essayist in this year's and many past years' 90-day studies. But Ron asks, is there any evidence that the common man in 1787 was reasonably knowledgeable about the differences in these types of governments and in the history of governments? Or was this something that only those more highly educated patriots understood?
Fantastic question, Ron. Thanks very much. It's interesting. One way to think about this is by comparing what Ron calls the common man in America, in the American states, to the common man in Europe, even Great Britain. In those places, to be a commoner meant you had very little education, very few opportunities for education. And so there were vast, the rates of illiteracy were extraordinary in Europe at the time among those outside of the privileged classes. In America, what you find is many, many more people among, what you might call the middle class or common class or something like that. I prefer the middle class personally, but they were so much better informed about basic ideas. And not that they all had a great formal education or anything like that, but they had more opportunities to learn about history. And the literacy rates, the ability of Americans in this country to read, the rates were so much higher here than in Europe at the time. It was very impressive. And how would they have been able to follow these kinds of arguments? It wasn't just an argument for, the elite class talking to the others of the elite class. Men and women on the streets on their way home from work or to the market were listening to these arguments. There were many of which were written and posted in newspapers, right, in the form of essays. They had the Federalist essays. And somebody who could read, if somebody couldn't read, somebody who could read would often take the newspaper, they would chain it or tie it to a post, and somebody would read it out loud and people would listen to it and they'd argue over it and debate it. Where were they learning these things in the absence of formal education? Just one example, churches. Most Americans went to churches. You can read these great sermons. Many great sermons have been preserved from the time where preachers are teaching them, people in church, they're giving them lessons in history and tying the lessons of history to the lessons of scripture and things like this. So I think Americans were very capable overall of understanding these arguments without ever having to have read Aristotle or Locke or anything like this. So, great question.
Well, thank you. And then Gary Porter, another one of our essayists in our 90-day study and just a great supporter of Constitution America. Gary is also a wonderful James Madison reenactor. But Gary asks a really important question. He says, many today point to threats to our democracy, yet it is obvious that we have a republic in the form of the United States. The pledge to the U.S. flag confirms this, if nothing else. What is the best way to respond to assertions that America is a democracy?
Yeah, wow, that's a great question. Well, there's the historical evidence, the art. It depends on whose arguments you want to focus on. So if you want to go back to the American founders, you find everybody, whether Federalists or Anti-Federalists, right, during ratification, saying we don't want a democracy. What we want is a republic with a democratic foundation. So we're a democracy, or we're meant to be a democracy to the extent that the people rule, right? There's a popular foundation and more people ought to rule, but through representation. And it becomes a republic by infusing the process of representation that builds upon that democratic base. Around the turn of the 20th century, you get more and more people known as progressives in particular who start using and preferring the term democracy, but that's partly for rhetorical effect. And they want to emphasize the fact that the country, though we have a republic, has become less and less democratic or popular, because the chief complaint of progressives around the 20th century, turn of the 20th century, was that it's really the wealthy corporations that are controlling politics and the people are being kept out of it. So progressives call for a resurgence of democracy, putting more emphasis on democratic participation and less on the representative process of a republic, because many of them identified that as having been corrupted or captured by business interests. So, but the rhetoric of progressives stuck throughout most of the 20th century. So I actually think today many people conflate or interchange the terms democracy and republic, and they call what we have, which I still think is a democratic republic, they simply call it a democracy, though it really is still a democratic republic. Great question. I wish I could take another hour to talk about that, but
Well, thank you. And we are right at time, but I want to read one comment real quick from Rick Mayberry. Rick says, this was a rich and informative seminar. The history of democracies, in particular Athenian and Roman democracies, add valuable context to understanding American democracy and the evolution of our society. Professor Burkett was superb, and I agree with Rick. Thank you so much, Professor Burkett. A multi-hour seminar in the future would be a wonderful gift. So thank you so much for being with us, Professor Burkett. And thank you to everyone who was with us today. And thank you for all your great questions and comments. I wish we could have gotten to all of them. And just as Jewel, Jorn, Aubrey, Professor Burkett, would any of you all like to make any closing comments?
I would just like to say,
Yeah, it's really great talking to you.
Thank you.
yeah, I just want to say thank you too. Thank you, Jordan and Joel. Great questions. Great to see you guys. And please tell Tova I said hello. I didn't get to say goodbye to her.
We were sorry to lose Tova, but at least she got her questions through. So anyway, thank you all for being with us, and come back next week. We're going to be talking about monarchies, and we're going to be talking with Professor Horg Niprath. So thank you all so much. Bye.
Happy Easter.
Happy Easter. Bye.